Have you ever wondered if true love could be broken by a single disagreement? Let's find out in this story. Richard, a hard-working young man who was preparing for what he thought would be the happiest day of his life. His wedding to Jane. Richard and Jane had met 2 years earlier during their National Youth Service. They quickly fell in love, and everyone around them admired their relationship. Dear viewers, you can imagine the kind of love Richard and Jane must have shared for people to admire their love. Richard, being from a humble background, always knew that starting his family would require careful planning and patience. Jane, on the other hand, was from a more affluent background, and she was used to a comfortable life and had dreams of living in the city, where she could continue the lifestyle she was accustomed to. Richard had no problem with this, but he knew that for now, his work was not able to rent a house in the big city. For now, they needed to be wise with their finances, especially with the wedding costs looming. Jane wants a lavish wedding, and Richard is trying his possible best to meet up with Jane's expectation. One day, just 2 weeks before the wedding, Richard and Jane were talking on the phone about their plans. "Where did you say we will live after the wedding?" Jane asked casually. "We will stay with my parents for just 2 months," Richard replied confidently. "After that, we will figure out the best place to rent in the city." Jane's tone shifted. "With your parents? In the village?" "Yes," Richard responded, not sensing any trouble. "We've talked about this before, Jane. It's just for a short while until we can save up a bit more money. City is expensive and I want to make sure we have enough to get by." But Jane was not convinced. She had always imagined starting her married life in her own space, not in a village, and certainly not with her in-laws. Dear viewers, what is your opinion on this? Would you want to stay with your in-laws after your marriage? Or you rather want to have your own space? Let's find out how all of this played out. "I'm sorry, Richard, but I'm not going to stay in the village with your parents. You need to rent a house in the city before the wedding, or there is no wedding." Richard was taken aback. He tried to reason with her. "Jane, we've already spent so much on the wedding preparations. I've even calculated the bride price and other expenses your family has asked for. It's more than $1 million, not to mention the cost of the wedding itself. Renting a house now would be too much. I thought we already agreed on this, to stay in my parents' house for a while, until I'm able to come up with the money to rent our own apartment. Jane, why are you talking like this?" But Jane was firm. "I'm not changing my mind. I can't live in your parents' house after my wedding. I want my own privacy, Richard. Yes, I knew I agreed, but I took a second thought. It's either you look for money to rent our own apartment, or I'm calling off the wedding. If you can't rent a house, then how will you take care of me in the marriage? A wedding that we are just about to start, a marriage that I'm about to go into. You want me to start my married life in your parents' house? What kind of a thing is that, Richard? I have said my mind and nothing is going to make me change it. You have to look for money to rent our own apartment after our wedding, or else there will be no wedding, Richard." Dear viewers, do you think Jane is overreacting? Or would you do the same thing as Jane is doing? And do you think Richard is also doing the right thing for wanting to live in his parents' house with his new bride, rather than look for money to rent an apartment? Let me know in the comment section. Let's learn from each other. Before I continue this story, this is a plea to you, my darling viewer. Yes, you that you're watching this video right now. Please, if you haven't subscribed on my channel, I'm pleading with you, please click on that subscribe button, be a part of my growth. And if you're a returning subscriber, hey, thank Thank you so much for coming back. I really appreciate your support and I do not take it for granted. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Let's go back to this story. Let's find out how Richard and Jane were able to settle their differences. Jane did exactly what she said and she called off the wedding. Richard was heartbroken. He had always been honest with Jane about his financial situation and his plans. He couldn't understand why she was suddenly so adamant about this, especially when they had already agreed on their post-wedding plans. Feeling the weight of the situation, he decided to visit her in her parents' house to talk things over, face to face. When he arrived at her house, he asked her directly, "Jane, have I done something wrong? Please, how can you call off the wedding just a week too? How about all the expenses we have spent on getting this wedding ready?" Jane looked at him with frustration. "Yes, Richard, you are not being responsible. I have never seen any responsible man who would marry and then take his wife to live with his parents." Richard was shocked. "But Jane, we've discussed this so many times. You know I couldn't afford to rent a house in the city for now. My father hasn't kicked me out of the house, and we're only going to stay there for a short time. I never said we're going to stay there forever. I'm only saying we should stay there for a few months after the wedding. I've never planned to leave you with my parents. They won't even be the ones taking care of you. We'll be living our own life, just in their home for a bit." Jane shook her head. "It doesn't matter. Any man who is ready for marriage should be able to provide a home for his wife. If you can't afford that, then you are not ready." Richard pleaded with her. "Jane, it's not that I don't want to provide for you. It's just that we need to be patient. Renting a house now would put us in a difficult situation. Please, Jane, I'm begging you, be patient with me." But Jane was unmoved. "I'm sorry, Richard. If you can't rent a house before the wedding, then there's no point in continuing this." Richard was heartbroken. He was so sad. He pleaded and pleaded with Jane. "Jane, please don't do this to me. You know my financial situation. I love you so much and I cannot afford to lose you. Please just understand with me. I promise you, in no time, I will rent our own apartment. Please, Jane." But Jane refused to listen. It was as if she turned a complete deaf ear to what Richard was saying. Desperate Richard reached out to his pastor, the pastor who was supposed to officiate their wedding. The pastor called both families together to discuss the issue, hoping to find a solution. "Jane," the pastor said gently, "marriage is about love, understanding and patience. Richard has been honest with you from the beginning about his plans. Are you sure this is a reason to call off the wedding?" But Jane remained firm. "I'm sure, Pastor. I can't go through with this marriage if we don't have a home of our own in the city." Seeing that Jane was not going to change her mind, Richard had no choice but to respect her decision. He loved her deeply, but he couldn't force her to marry him. He returned back to the village where he was staying, heartbroken. And that was how Jane went ahead to call off the wedding with Richard, and they ended up not getting married to each other because Richard wasn't able to afford a rent in the city. As time passed, Richard threw himself into his work, trying to forget the pain of losing Jane. He focused on his business, determined to make something of himself. Meanwhile, Jane moved on with her life in the city. She eventually met someone else, someone who could provide the lifestyle she wanted. They got married, and Jane was finally living in the big city, just as she had always dreamed of. However, life wasn't as perfect as she had imagined. The man she married, though wealthy, and able to provide for her material needs, was not the loving partner she had hoped for. He was often busy with work, leaving Jane feeling lonely and unfulfilled. She began to realize that perhaps she had given up something valuable when she ended things with Richard. One day, Jane ran into a mutual friend who told her that Richard had done well for himself. He had expanded his business, built his own house, and was now happily married to another woman. Oh my goodness, dear viewers, did you just hear that? Someone who had been patient and supportive of him during the tough times. Jane couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. Jane reached out to Richard, not to rekindle any romance, but to apologize for how things had ended between them. She wanted to make peace with the past and move forward. Richard, being the kind-hearted person he was, accepted her apology. They both agreed that while they had once loved each other, their lives had taken different paths, and that was okay. Richard was now a content and fulfilled man, grateful for the lessons he had learnt. Jane, though still feeling some regret, knew that she needed to focus on making the best of her current life, because obviously she can't go back to Richard anymore. Dear viewers, what is your opinion on Jane and Richard's story? Is this enough reason for Jane to call off the wedding? Well, in my opinion, true love is patient and understanding. Material things can fade, but a bond built on trust and mutual respect lasts a lifetime. This story reminds us that life is not just about immediate gratification. Sometimes, being patient and supporting your partner during challenging times can lead to a stronger, more fulfilling relationship. It's essential to look beyond the material aspects and consider the emotional and spiritual bonds that truly makes a marriage strong. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I hope you were not just entertained, but you were able to learn a thing or two. Do not forget, please, to leave your opinion in the comment section because I would like to know. And please, if you haven't subscribed, please click on that subscribe button. Be a part of my growth. I will really appreciate that. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your time. I do not take it for granted. Thank you. See you in my next video. Bye-bye.